Hello, everyone. I'm Doreen Samelson. Some of you may have seen some of my other videos. I've done some videos about different interventions that can be useful when working with autistic children or children with IDD who don't have autism. And most recently, I made a video talking about my son in terms of goals and what is a meaningful goal and what might not be such a meaningful goal. Today, I thought I might take a few minutes to talk to you about identity. Now, I'm old enough to remember when we really didn't talk about identity. You were sort of born as a girl or a boy, and then people kind of told you what your identity was in terms of gender, probably also told you what your identity was in terms of things like sexual orientation, maybe religious identity or ethnic and racial identity. And pretty much that stuff was kind of dictated to us in a lot of different ways. One of the things that we've realized as time goes on is that there's a lot of different identities. And one of the identities that was not talked about when I was young is the identity of a disabled person, to identify as disabled. In fact, when I was young, having a disability, being disabled was kind of a negative thing. You wouldn't want to identify with it. People tried to come up with different terms like differently able and things like that, that kind of sounded like the person wasn't actually disabled when they actually were disabled. What's been really interesting for me as a disabled person is that the identity as a disabled person has become something that's okay to talk about. I do identify as disabled. I also identify as being an older woman and a mother, and a few other things, a psychologist and a few other things, but I do identify as a disabled person. And one of the groups that has really probably been in the forefront for identity as a disabled person has been those people who are deaf. So the deaf community has said, I'm deaf, I'm not a person who's hearing impaired, I'm actually deaf. And that's not true for the entire community, of course, but many people in the deaf community identify as deaf. Another group of people that have talked about identifying as identity first, right? We say identity first when we're talking about identity in this way, is autistic individuals. And many autistic adults and some autistic youth choose to identify as autistic. So they use the identity first language, autistic person versus a person with autism or a person with ASD. This is a very personal thing, of course, and just because I might use identity first as a disabled person doesn't mean that everybody who uses a wheelchair is going to be using that same language to describe themselves. I think one of the most wonderful things, and what we've learned, what I've learned from the deaf community, from the autistic community, is that it's fine to identify yourself in a way that works for you. If you're a parent of an autistic child, youth, or adult, you may find that your child, youth, or adult is identifying as autistic, and they may prefer that identity first language versus the person first languages like person with autism, or I would be person with a physical disability. So it can be a little bit of a change for those of us who are a little bit older. And when we were growing up, we didn't have identity first, but identity first language is perfectly okay. It's perfectly appropriate and it's a personal choice, as is person first language. So some people say, no, I'm a person first, my disability is second, and I identify as a person with a disability or a person who uses a wheelchair. So it's all about personal choice. It's something that's important for all of us to think about and talk about, and then support people who choose either identity first or person first language.